there's two angles. One is just assuming that they have the same goals that we would also have. And I think as you're a leading economist and financial sector expert, and I think we would all agree that it is good to have financial stability and to have stable, sustainable economic growth. And so most people work with this as a premise, and they assume that, of course, that's the goal. So what do we do to achieve this goal? And if we assume that has been the goal, then they haven't used it wisely in 2020. But why not? And it seems they were either misinformed or there seemed to have been some kind of coordination at play. As I said, what they did in 2020, this purchase of assets from non-banks, is very specific. It's very unusual and also very rare to implement that policy if you go into central bank history. But they all did the same thing at the same time, so that it's quite obvious it was coordinated. So that's an interesting empirical question to research into. Who was leading that coordination? What was their thinking? And what were the goals? And I don't have the details yet, but we should look into this. Perhaps as a research project, we're very interested. Now, the other answer to your question is that it may also be that their goals were different from what we would sensibly, like to have as a goal, namely financial stability, economic growth, sustainable growth. And I've encountered this before, and initially it's a bit surprising, but it can be that sometimes policymakers take the view that sometimes a shock to the system is good, and sometimes we need a crisis in order to make changes. Now, I'm a critic of that. If that is the case, then that's not good. But that could also be a reason why they were not wise.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Richard. So in your opinion, for the year 2023, will the Federal Reserve successfully control the inflation rates around 2%?
Well, there has been a quantitative tightening. If we look at the same measures that I mentioned, then that was tightened in the year 2021, last year. More recently, it's expanded again. So because we have this lag effect, this 18 months or lead time of credit over the economy, to me it does look like inflation has peaked, more or less, and is likely to come down. But what happens after that is still an open question. To me, it looks like, well, it will then come back. But that's work in progress. We have to continue to monitor what they're doing in terms of the quantity of credit creation. Whether they'll achieve 2%, I doubt it. But it could drop back to, I could imagine something like 3-4%, and perhaps even 2%. But then maybe as an average, you maybe not likely to get 2% for the whole year. But we could briefly, by the end of the year, drop back to 2%. Unfortunately, maybe after that, it will accelerate again, which makes it again quite similar to the 70s, where we had a first bout of inflation, then that tapered off, but then there was a few years later another bout of inflation. Let's see whether that's the scenario, but we mustn't forget that the central banks are very much in charge of this, and we should keep, monitoring them and put pressure on them to take the wise policies, because sadly, they do this in Europe and America not so often. I'm a great admirer of the Chinese central bank. As you know, I believe the central bank has done a fantastic job. We had 40 years of double-digit economic growth, unprecedented in world history. And sadly, somehow in Europe and America, central banks often seem to be playing other games.
Richard, thank you for thinking highly of Chinese central bank. So we know that our focus of today's conversation is about quantitative easing, and we know this is of course important for inflation. And another important factor for inflation is indeed war. We know war is rare, but in Europe, particularly there is a war and push up the oil price, which is somehow related to the high inflation. So in this year, particularly this year, do you think if you put a weight on the quantitative easing, on the monetary policy versus the real war? So do you think what's the relative weight of these two factors in contributing in today's inflation, in your opinion?
It's clearly not the war. It is not the war. Certainly, or let me be more precise, it's not the war's effect on energy prices that is a causal factor. The war may be influential in another way. In terms of money creation, we see that many countries are giving billions and billions to Ukraine. And certainly in Ukraine, we have a massive injection of credit creation and purchasing power. And they're spending like crazy, and they have billions and billions, which, it's not such a huge economy. This is a lot of money. So that money injection may be the main reason why the war is relevant. But if we look at the energy prices, one fact is that many people are surprised when you point it out. Now the oil price is lower than before the war started in February. The oil price is already significantly lower. So actually, there was a bit of an increase in March, but then it's gone down, and it's been below the January levels for quite a while.